What's up, everybody? This is Sophie. I'm your host, and this is the first installment of Is Anybody Out There's Spooky Weird Book Club. I am happy to announce the beginning of our Patreon exclusive series in a special on our regular pod. In the book club, you can listen to my opinions about the books I read in order to research the topic of that week's episode of Is Anybody Out There? And if you're a Patreon member, you can also join in a discussion about the book on Patreon. And if we get enough Patreon supporters, we're going to be able to get better editing software, which will improve the quality of our sound. So if any of you feel so inclined as to help us out, we would so appreciate that. Thank you so much. So this episode is going to be posted on the regular Is Anybody Out There podcast, so anyone can listen to see if they're going to be interested in the Spooky Weird Book Club, but it's going to be just a teaser. So coming up, it's going to be just for the Patreons only. So now, without further ado, let's go ahead and talk about the books. I personally have always loved books, so I thought this would be a good way for me to wax eloquent on the great books, or maybe not so great books that I read. They're not going to be super long episodes. It's going to be just a mini pod because who wants to hear me talking to myself for an hour? But I do want to encourage some conversation on the Facebook group page or in the Patreon community if anyone else has read these books. So today we're going to start off the series by talking about the books I read for the Salem Witch Trials episode. There were a ton of research materials out there, so if you want even more than what I'll share here, I'll give a list of what I used on Patreon and some others that I didn't even get to, as well as actually visiting Salem and talking to people at the museum and talking to historians and reading articles. I read 3 books that I'm going to talk about today. A Storm of Witchcraft by Emerson W. Baker, Witch, Unleashed, Untamed, Unapologetic by Lisa Lister, and The Salem Witch Trials, a day-to-day chronicle of a community under siege by Marilyn K. Roach. So let's start with The Salem Witch Trials by Roach. Roach is a historian who was part of the Gallows Hill Project, which verified the correct site of the hangings in 1692. This was contested for a really long time before her team confirmed it, so that's a really important discovery. The location had been forgotten or ignored until she was able to work with a Salem lawyer and antiquarian named Sidney Purley to come up with a definite conclusion of where the site was in 1997. She has a long rap sheet of publications, including works for the Boston Globe, the New England Historical Genealogical Register, and the Lizzie Borden Quarterly. Roach focuses primarily on the witch trials in Salem. This book that I'm talking about right now actually took 27 years to research and write. This book is really brilliantly researched. She put a ton of work into it. And when reading it, you can tell the depth of care that she's put into it to accurately depict the trials. Marilyn Roach is a brilliant, determined historian, and I personally have huge respect for her. The Salem Witch Trials, as you might get from the title, is about the Salem Witch Trials. It's a day-by-day, literally, account of what happened. This is incredible that she was able to pull this off, and it also gives great context to what was going on in the minds and lives of the people who lived at that time. That being said, the book is a very detailed account of people's day-to-day lives. While I personally found it extremely interesting for the most part, because even the parts that we're just talking about the everyday lives is history, and that helped me get to know the people better that were involved. For the average reader, it might have been a bit sloggy. It's a historical read, so there's definitely a preference thing there too. I get that. Some people don't enjoy reading historical stuff. It's not historical fiction or anything, so that's totally fine. I definitely get that. It can be boring at times, but it does give a really well-rounded view of the way of life and the mindsets of the Puritans, as well as the other communities that were living around them, which I found to be very valuable. All in all, I have mad respect for Miss Roach. She has done a ton to keep the memory of those who lost their lives at Salem alive, and to bring awareness to not only the injustice that brought about their deaths, but also the circumstances that may have contributed to them. She's written a bunch of articles too, as I mentioned, and another book called 6 Women of Salem, The Untold Story of the Accused and Their Accusers in the Salem Witch Trials. which I haven't actually read yet, but I do look forward to reading it as it's on my list. So all in all, I would give that book a probably 6 out of 10. It was really good, really, really informative, a little bit boring at times, just from an entertainment perspective. But for a research perspective, it was a really, really great resource. Emerson W. Baker wrote the next book that I'm going to talk about, A Storm of Witchcraft. Let me just say, wow, what a great book. I loved this book so much. Seriously, I read this book like twice. I liked it so much, and my list of book to read is so long that if I read a book twice instead of just moving on, you know that book was a good one. So Mr. Baker is a historical archaeologist who is well known in academic circles. He has worked on several archaeological sites along the east coast of the U.S., and he has many degrees, including a PhD from the College of William and Mary. He currently lives in York, Maine, and if there's any interest, I'm thinking about looking him up and seeing if he'll maybe be a guest on the podcast. Let me know if anyone wants that, if anyone's interested in that. He is also a really brilliant man, and I have mad respect for him as well. So if I had him as a guest, I would probably be hugely intimidated, but you know, anything for you guys. Anyway, his book, A Storm of Witchcraft, is so well written that it is hugely entertaining as well as incredibly well researched and informative. There was no part of it where I was bored. None at all. In the book, Baker outlines the background situation going on around the witch trials and the political, social, and religious situations that contributed to the actions of the accused and the accusers in Salem in 1692. His argument is that there was no one cause for the hysteria that happened. Rather, that several different factors, including a new government, a frontier war, and different town conflicts came together to tragically result in the events at Salem. One of my favorite things about this book, though, was that he also goes into detail about the events that happened after the witch trials. How the Puritan government attempted to suppress the story and erase it from the memory of popular culture, and how this kind of backfired and over the years evolved into that, you know, carnival of spooky glory that is Salem today. There is a quote in the book's description on Amazon that I really loved, so I'm going to read it. Quote, "A brilliantly told tale, A Storm of Witchcraft also puts Salem's storm into its broader context as a part of the ongoing narrative of American history and the history of the Atlantic world." End quote. The book contextualizes the events at Salem in their place among American history, and the way the political climate morphed from Puritan communalism to favoring a general doubt toward moral authority and the ties between religion and government. I personally strongly recommend this book. Not only was it a good read, but it also shows how different factors in our lives as humans affect our actions, which to me is something that everyone can learn from and apply to what we see happening in the world today. Great, great, great book. Highly, highly recommend this book. I would probably give that a 9 out of 10 just because I feel like I can't do a 10 out of 10, but it was really, really good. Okay, the next and final book I'm going to talk about is Witch, Unleashed, Untamed, Unapologetic by Lisa Lister. Let me just say, this is a pretty controversial book. I actually started reading it as research for Is Anybody Out There's History of Witchcraft episode, and it was influential in helping to fully form my opinion about the definition of a witch. Now, there are definitely some things in this book that I don't agree with. I am not a Wiccan, although no hate towards that religion as it's super peaceful, and I definitely respect everyone who believes that. Lisa Lister, if I remember correctly, actually isn't a Wiccan either, but she does come from a long line of what she calls in the book, quote, traveler witches, end quote. She is actually, factually, an awesome woman. Lisa isn't like the other authors I've talked about today in that she's not a strictly historian by trade. She's not in the same realm of intellectuals, although she is definitely really brilliant. She has a shirt that says, quote, I heart Mr. Darcy, end quote. So I think that's really all you need to know about her. The book is basically an outline or a beginner's textbook for baby witches, which is great, but the reason I read it was because she goes into detail about the history behind witchcraft and why identifying as a healer in past centuries led women to be killed, and also how the word witch got its negative connotations. She posits that all women are witches when they find their power. The book itself is super empowering to women while respecting men at the same time, and emphasizes being a wise woman who connects with her passions and her purpose. There's a balance between men and women and an acknowledgement that we are different but connected, which is something that I really liked about the book. I believe that we're all connected to each other and that other people are more important than ourselves, focusing on kindness, consideration, and empathy. This is one of my strongest beliefs. And Lisa Lister echoes that in her book, but she also teaches that the modern woman has to respect herself, because if you don't understand and respect yourself, you can't understand others. The book didn't have anything to do with Salem at all, but it was a good read, and it will stay on my important information for life bookshelf as something I will probably come back to again and again for advice. One of my personal struggles is accepting that I take up space. I have a problem asking for help. I know I apologize too much. I feel like I'm causing a problem just by existing. Lisa Lister is, for her career, an advocate for women to share their voices and to recognize that everything about being a woman is a blessing. This book helped to show me that, guess what? I'm here. I exist. And that's okay. I matter as a woman and as a person. I think that a lot of other people, women in particular, struggle with this kind of thing, and this book actually gives a little bit of background as to why that is. It's interesting to me how much of history we actually aren't taught, but there's definitely a clear line of thinking that led to a lot of women's insecurities today. And that's not me being a crazy feminist, that's just the unfortunate truth, and that line of history isn't something that I, at least, was taught in school. And like I said, I didn't like everything she had to say. There's some stuff in there that I was like, okay, well, that's going a tad overboard, don't you think, Lisa? But we all have to be discerning, and just because you don't agree with someone doesn't mean they didn't do a hell of a job putting together a book. It's a hard thing to do, and she did a really good job. So I think even though I didn't agree with every single thing in this book, I love the positive attitude Lisa has towards women and the way she wants to encourage every woman to take charge of their lives. We take up space, and that's okay. That's all for today, I think. I hope that you all would join me for the next little installment of the Spooky Weird Book Club, if you feel like, and are able to join our second or third tier membership plans on Patreon. We so appreciate all of you, and thank you for your support. It really means so much to us. It really, really does. It means so much. We have plans for this podcast, and we can't do it without you guys listening and supporting us and being there for us. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And thanks again. Bye. If you liked this, make sure to check out our website, www.iaotpod.com. That's www.iaotpod.com. Or you can like our page on Facebook or Instagram and check out our Patreon. Thanks! Say it loud for the people at the back.